The rain had been relentless all evening, hammering the asphalt and turning the narrow Appalachian roads into slick ribbons of black. I had just finished a late shift at the diner, the fluorescent lights still buzzing in my head, and I was more than ready to crawl into my warm bed. The road home was one I had traveled 100 times, a winding ribbon of asphalt that clung to the side of the mountain like a vein, bordered on one side by dense forest and on the other by the steep drop-off of the valley. My headlights cut through the mist, but it was thick tonight, clinging to the treetops and curling around the bends, muting the sound of my tires on the slick road. There was something comforting about the fog in a way, a kind of soft insulation against the world, until I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the old wooden bridge that spanned a creek I could barely hear through the rainfall. At first, I thought it was someone stranded, maybe a girl who had slipped off the road or gotten lost in the fog. My chest tightened instinctively, and I slowed the car to a crawl, eyes straining against the mist. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. Even in the hazy glow of my headlights, I couldn't make out her features clearly. Her hair plastered to her face, her clothes clinging as though they had been soaked for hours. But it wasn't just the wetness. There was something wrong about the way she stood, unnaturally still, her shoulders stiff, her head slightly tilted like she was listening to something only she could hear. I called out, my voice cracking against the roar of the rain. "Hey, are you okay?" The word seemed swallowed by the fog immediately, bouncing back to me distorted and faint. No response. I tried again, louder, leaning forward in my seat, my hands tightening on the wheel. The bridge groaned beneath the weight of my car as the tires hit the wooden planks. The sound was hollow and oddly metallic, echoing far too long in the foggy night. My pulse was hammering in my ears when I pressed the brakes, bringing the car to a tentative stop only a few feet from her. Then, just as I unbuckled my seatbelt, ready to step out and offer help, she was gone. Nothing left behind but the mist curling lazily across the wet planks. My eyes darted from side to side, my breath quick and shallow. I pressed my hands to the steering wheel, feeling the slickness of rain seep through the cracks in the glass, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the fog, that she had stepped off the bridge somewhere into the shadows. But something in the pit of my stomach knew better. My legs shook as I eased the car forward, headlights sweeping the surrounding woods, and I saw nothing. Not a trace. I tried to rationalize it as I drove the remaining miles home. Maybe she had been hiding behind the guardrail and ducked when I called out. Maybe someone had played a cruel prank. My mind churned possibilities, but the unease didn't fade. It clung to me like the damp air in my lungs, heavy and suffocating. By the time I reached my small cabin perched on the edge of the woods, my hands were clammy, and my heart still thumped erratically. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things. I had always been alone in these hills, and the isolation had a way of twisting shadows into faces and whispers into voices. But when I stepped onto my porch, the air hit me differently. Colder, somehow sharper than it had been outside. The rain had slowed, leaving a fine mist that settled into every crevice of the cabin's wooden siding. I hesitated at the door, hand on the handle, and then froze. Wet footprints, small and delicate, trailed across the porch, leading from the edge straight to my front door. I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. My cabin had been empty all day. I live alone. Every instinct screamed at me not to go in, to turn around and drive back to the nearest town, but I pushed the door open anyway. The air inside was warm but smelled faintly of damp wood, like the bridge, like rain-soaked earth. My eyes scanned the floor, and there they were again, wet footprints leading from the entryway through the kitchen, toward the back of the house. My chest tightened, breath coming in shallow gasps. I dropped my keys onto the counter and tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a leftover mark from someone who had delivered something earlier. But the pattern didn't make sense. The prints were fresh, as though someone had walked silently through my home moments before, disappearing as mysteriously as they had appeared. I reached for the phone, but the screen flickered uselessly. No signal. Not even a bar. My stomach churned as I glanced around, the kitchen now eerily silent save for the steady dripping from the leaky roof. I could feel it then, the sense of being watched. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, pooling in corners and under cabinets, shifting slightly when I blinked. My eyes darted to the living room. where the floorboards creaked softly. Someone, or something, was moving in the house. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, flicking it on to pierce the darkness. The beam trembled in my hands, illuminating the familiar objects of my home. The worn sofa, the stacked firewood, the clock ticking steadily on the wall. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, the footprints didn't stop. They ended abruptly at the threshold to the hallway leading to my bedroom. I hesitated there, heart hammering in my chest, the beam shaking slightly. I wanted to call out to ask who was there, but my voice caught in my throat. Something didn't want to be disturbed. I took a tentative step down the hall, the flashlight casting long shadows against the walls, my mind racing. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep, every groan of the house like a whisper. And then I saw it, something impossible. On the wall, near the ceiling, faint streaks of wetness traced downward as though someone had pressed their hands against the plaster. The streaks glimmered in the flashlight's beam, leading me toward my bedroom door. My hands were shaking so badly I had to brace myself against the frame. I pushed the door open slowly, and the room was empty. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, save for the faint mist curling along the floor, pooling like it had followed her here. I exhaled shakily, trying to calm the rising panic, telling myself I had imagined it, that the fog had gotten into my mind and played tricks on me. And then I saw the reflection. The small bedroom mirror, propped against the wall, fogged over from the rain, and through the condensation I saw her. Just a glimpse, so faint I almost thought I was dreaming, but enough to make my blood run cold. She was standing behind me, pressed close to the wall, watching. I spun around, flashlight stabbing at the darkness, but nothing was there. The mirror fogged over completely as though someone had exhaled onto it, and in the distorted reflection, I thought I saw a smile. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, flashlight clutched to my chest, ears straining for the slightest noise, heart thundering with every imagined creak. Dawn came eventually, gray and muted through the fogged windows, and I finally forced myself to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. When I returned, I noticed the footprints again. Smaller now, leading to the back door. I flung it open, hoping she had finally gone, but the yard was empty, the fog clinging stubbornly to the treeline, hiding whatever had been with me. Days passed, though it felt longer. Every creak, every sigh of the cabin, set my nerves on edge. I stopped leaving the house after dark. I avoided the bridge entirely, taking the long way around the winding roads, though I could never shake the memory of her still form, the way the fog clung to her, the way she seemed almost to breathe the mist itself. And then one night, a week later, I woke to a sound I had come to dread, the soft patter of wet footsteps across the floorboards. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding, and I reached for the flashlight. The trail had started again, leading from the porch to the kitchen, just like before. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening, paralyzed, as the steps grew closer. By the time the sun rose again, the footprints had vanished, and the house was silent. But I knew, deep down, that she hadn't left. And I don't know if she ever will. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in from the mountains and the rain hammers the roads, I swear I see her again, standing just beyond the headlights, waiting, motionless, for me to slow down. And every time I do. The rain had been relentless for hours, hammering the tin roof of my grandparents' old cabin so hard I could barely hear myself think. The air inside smelled of damp wood and old pine, thick with the mustiness of decades spent in the shadows of the mountains. I had come to the cabin for a weekend alone, thinking it would be peaceful, a way to escape the constant hum of my city life. But now, sitting on the worn couch with a blanket wrapped tightly around me, I realized how alone I really was. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, and the rain beat against the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. Every sound was amplified in the quiet of the night, making the cabin feel smaller, tighter, more suffocating. It was around midnight when I first noticed it, a soft scratching sound from above me. At first, I dismissed it. The cabin was old, the floorboards creaked, the roof settled, and the attic was practically a hollow cavity waiting to echo any small sound. But the scratching grew more deliberate, more insistent, a slow scraping that seemed to move along the length of the ceiling beams. My chest tightened, and I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. Yet, as I listened, the sound began to shift. It became a faint whisper, too soft to understand at first, like someone breathing heavily into the corner of the room. Then I heard it clearly, my name. Whispered. Not from the air around me, but inside my head, threaded through the static of the storm, urgent and unmistakable. Ellie. My heart leapt into my throat, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here, hadn't mentioned the trip to a single soul. How could someone know I was alone? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was the wind moving through the cracks, the way old houses play tricks on your mind at night. But the scratching continued, paired with the whispering, and I realized I had no choice but to see where it was coming from. I got to my feet slowly, careful not to make too much noise, and made my way to the narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The steps groaned under my weight, the wood slick from the humidity, each creak echoing through the house like a gunshot in the dark. My flashlight barely cut through the inky shadows of the stairs, illuminating peeling wallpaper and cobwebs thick with dust. As I climbed, the whispers grew louder, pressing against my mind. They weren't words I could hear with my ears. They were inside me, in the corners of my thoughts, urgent and almost pleading. The rain against the roof seemed to fall around me in waves, masking and unmasking the whispers as I ascended, until I reached the attic door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob, and the hinges groaned in protest. The attic was small, claustrophobic, filled with the relics of my grandparents' life. Old trunks, moth-eaten furniture, stacks of yellowed papers. The air smelled of damp cardboard and mildew. I swept the flashlight across the room, and that's when I saw her. The window at the far end was streaked with rain, but I could make out the faint outline of a woman staring in. Her hair clung to her face like dark water, and though her lips didn't move, the whispers were unmistakable now, pressing directly into my skull. Ellie. I froze, my chest tightening so much I could barely breathe. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and a bead of sweat ran down my temple despite the cold air. I couldn't see her eyes clearly, just the suggestion of a hollow, desperate stare, and yet I felt her looking directly at me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave the cabin and never come back. But I was rooted in place, unable to move, my mind entangled with the whispers that had become a chorus of voices, all calling my name, some crying, some laughing softly. I stepped closer, hand outstretched toward the window, and that's when I noticed the condensation forming on the glass from my warm breath inside the attic. The outline of her face pressed faintly into it, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, tripping over a trunk, my flashlight clattering to the floor and spinning, casting wild shadows across the room. The whispers became frantic, overlapping, almost frantic in tone. I could feel my pulse in my temples, every nerve in my body screaming for me to leave, but something kept me there, fixated on the window, on her face imprinted in the condensation. I slammed the window shut, the sudden impact startling me more than it did her. The whispers stopped immediately. The scratching, the cold pressure of unseen eyes, everything vanished. The attic was silent except for the rain still hammering the roof. I sank to the floor, shaking, tears running down my cheeks, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My flashlight lay on its side, casting a pale beam across the dusty floorboards. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation had twisted my mind. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, too afraid to climb back upstairs. I kept the lights on, listening to the rain and the wind, trying to convince myself that the woman was gone, that the whispers were just a trick of my imagination. But every time I looked toward the ceiling, toward the attic door, I felt it, the sense of being watched, the cold brush of something lingering just out of sight. The next morning, I tried to shrug it off as exhaustion, the result of sleeping poorly and the storm's oppressive weight. I tidied the cabin, made some coffee, and tried to immerse myself in ordinary tasks. Yet, when I glanced at the attic window from the kitchen, my stomach dropped. The faint outline of her face was still there, pressed into the condensation as if she had never left. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and for a moment it was gone. But when I looked again, it was there, staring, and I could almost hear that whisper, soft and pleading. Ellie. I didn't leave the cabin that day. I couldn't bring myself to. The forest seemed heavier, the trees bending under the rain in ways that felt deliberate, as though they were leaning in to watch me. Every sound was amplified: the scuttle of small animals, the drip of water from the eaves, even the creak of the rocking chair my grandfather had left in the corner. At night, the whispers returned, softer, more insistent. Sometimes I would wake to the scratching at the ceiling, or the faint sound of footsteps moving above me. And though I never saw her fully, I felt her presence, a weight pressing down on me, patient and relentless. I thought about leaving the next weekend, but I couldn't. Something kept me there, some pull I couldn't name. The window, the condensation, the face. I kept expecting it to vanish, to be gone for good, but it never did. Each night, I would see the faint imprint of her features, hear the whispers, and feel the scratching at the ceiling. And each time I did, the cabin seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing closer, the air heavier. Weeks later, when the rain finally let up, I ventured outside to try and convince myself it was all in my head. The forest was still and quiet, the storm long past, but a chill clung to the ground, and the attic window reflected the pale gray sky. I thought I saw a shadow move inside, but it disappeared when I blinked. The memory of her face, her voice, the way she pressed herself against the glass, remained with me. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, and I realized I didn't want to. The thought of ignoring it, of walking away and pretending it had never happened, felt wrong in some deep, instinctive way. Now, whenever I hear the rain hammering on a roof or the wind whistling through the trees, I think of her. I think of that night in the attic, the whispering, the scraping, and the face pressed into the condensation, staring at me. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I swear I can still hear her voice in my head, soft and urgent, calling my name. And I don't know what she wants, or why she calls me. But I know this: she hasn't left, and somehow I don't think she ever will. The storm came without warning, or at least, without the warning I noticed. One moment, the sky was a dull gray. The next it was a wall of rain hammering the asphalt, turning the winding mountain roads into slick, reflective ribbons of black. I had left work later than usual that evening, hoping to avoid the worst of the traffic in the valley, and decided on a detour through the mountains. My GPS chirped cheerfully as I followed its instructions, leading me onto a narrow road I didn't recognize, wedged between steep ridges and thick, dark forest. The trees leaned over the road like silent sentinels, their wet branches scraping against the windshield with each gust of wind. The fog rolled in fast, clinging to the road and muting the sound of my tires on the slick asphalt. Everything outside the headlights was a gray, shifting blur, and I realized quickly that I was utterly alone. At first, the drive was unsettling in the usual way, the usual anxiety that comes with winding mountain roads in the dark. The way a tree seemed too close, the way shadows pooled in the corners of your eyes. I tried to focus on the GPS, but its cheerful voice seemed almost off, directing me with a casual certainty that contrasted sharply with the storm. "Turn right in 200 feet, it said, as if the twisting, slick ribbon of road ahead was perfectly ordinary. I followed the instructions anyway, gripping the wheel tightly as my tires skidded slightly on a patch of wet leaves. Hours felt like minutes. The road twisted impossibly, folding back on itself, the same stretches of forest repeating like a bad hallucination. My fuel gauge ticked lower, my headlights cutting through the mist with diminishing reach. That's when I saw it, a car ahead, stopped in the middle of the road, headlights flickering. It wasn't a large vehicle, just an older model sedan, hunched in the rain like it had been abandoned. I slowed instinctively, heart thudding in my chest, my windshield wipers fighting to keep the spray from obscuring my view. The man inside caught my attention immediately. He was drenched, rain pouring from his hair and clothes, sitting rigidly behind the wheel. He stared straight at me, expression blank but unsettlingly intent, as if he could see into me in a way no one else ever had. I waved instinctively, calling out through the rain. "Are you okay?" The sound of my own voice seemed swallowed by the storm. For a moment I thought he would respond, that he would roll down the window, that I could help him somehow. And then, just like that, he was gone. The seat was empty, the car silent, the flickering headlights the only remaining evidence that someone had ever been there. A cold panic set in. My grip tightened on the wheel, and I gunned the engine, trying to put as much distance between myself and that stretch of road as I could. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, My stomach dropped. The road behind me had vanished. Where there should have been the continuation of asphalt winding down the mountain, there was now only a sheer drop, a wall of mist curling over the edge like it was waiting to swallow anything that fell. My headlights illuminated nothing but gray nothingness, and the familiar reassurance of the road I had just driven vanished entirely. I slammed my foot on the brakes, heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear the rain. The GPS chirped again, oblivious. Continue straight for 1 mile. There was no road. Only mist. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and shook my head, trying to convince myself this was some sort of illusion, some trick of the rain and fog. But the sensation of vertigo, the impossibility of what I was seeing, made my stomach churn. I forced myself forward slowly, inch by inch, tires squealing on the wet pavement that reappeared beneath me as if the road had decided to return at the last possible second. Time became slippery. Minutes stretched and compressed in ways that made no sense. Every turn looked the same, every tree identical, every shadow looming just a little too long. I could hear the storm pounding on the roof of my car, the wipers struggling to keep up with the sheer volume of rain. The mountain twisted endlessly before me, and I began to realize that I had no idea which direction was up or down, which turn had already passed. The GPS kept directing me, smiling in its mechanical voice, but the road beneath me didn't seem to exist outside of that tiny illuminated strip. That's when I saw him again. Another car, or perhaps the same one, I couldn't tell, stopped ahead, lights flickering, parked in the middle of the road like a sentinel. The man was inside, sitting completely still, drenched through, staring at me with that same empty intensity. I tried to wave again, tried to call out, but before I could, he vanished. The car didn't move, didn't fall into the mist. It simply wasn't there anymore. And that's when I felt it, a creeping, crawling terror that wasn't about the storm, the rain, or the twisting roads. It was something far older, something that didn't belong to the world I knew. I pushed the accelerator, desperate now, my hands white on the wheel. I couldn't go back. I didn't know if I could go forward. The road ahead seemed endless, looping impossibly, folding over itself in ways that made no sense. I passed landmarks I thought I recognized, only to see them again moments later. A rock formation, a bend in the road, a gnarled tree with branches clawing at the sky. It all repeated, mocking me, bending reality around me like some cruel trick. Eventually, the mountains gave way, or at least I thought they did. The rain lessened, the fog thinned, and I found myself on a familiar stretch of highway leading toward town. My hands shook uncontrollably, my pulse still racing, but the relief was immediate. I glanced at the GPS in disbelief. The little screen still showed the road I had just driven, snaking impossibly through the mountains, marked clearly on the map. I tapped the screen, zoomed in and out, refreshed the device, but it didn't exist anywhere else. Not on any map I had seen, not in any atlas, not in any official record. Yet there it was, glaring back at me from my phone, confident, unyielding, and entirely impossible. I didn't speak of it for days. I tried to rationalize it, storm hallucination, exhaustion, a glitch in the GPS, but deep down I knew none of that explained the man in the car, the way the road had vanished behind me, the repetition of the mountain bends. I've driven those mountains many times since, avoiding that detour entirely, but sometimes in the back of my mind I picture that road. I imagine the mist curling around the edges, the headlights cutting through the fog, and the man inside the car, staring at me with eyes that seem to reach into my soul. And sometimes, when the rain starts to hammer down in the valley, and the fog rolls in from the ridges, I swear I can see the road again, twisting impossibly between the trees, waiting for the next traveler who thinks they're just taking a shortcut. I don't know where that road goes, or why it appeared only for me. I don't know if the man was real, or if he was part of the mountain, part of the storm, a fragment of the forest itself. All I know is this: the GPS still shows it, bright and unwavering, and I have no desire to follow it. Some roads, I've learned, were never meant to be driven. Some paths exist only to trap you, to remind you that the mountains have their own rules, their own kind of patience. And that night, I found out just how terrifying it can be to stumble across one. The rain fell in sheets that night, turning the mountain slopes into rushing rivers and hammering against the roof of my friend's cabin with a relentless insistence. The kind of storm that roars in your ears, blurs the trees into shapeless gray forms, and makes you question whether you're really alone in the dark. I had arrived in the late afternoon, soaked through and chilled to the bone, grateful for the cabin's warmth, the crackling fire, and the smell of old wood mingled with pine sap. But as night settled in and the storm intensified, the walls of the cabin began to feel closer, more confining, and the shadows stretched across the corners of the room in ways that seemed deliberate, almost alive. I lit candles to ward off the oppressive darkness, their soft glow trembling on the walls, casting long, wavering shadows. The flickering light made the room feel warmer, but also made every movement outside the windows more pronounced. I could see the rain pounding the porch in rhythmic, angry bursts, the water sluicing off the roof and down the support beams, making the timber slick and glistening. I was just beginning to relax, listening to the storm and the occasional pop from the fireplace, when I noticed movement outside. At first, I thought it was a trick of the rain, a shadow twisting in the water-streaked glass. But then I saw him. A man, standing perfectly still on the porch, holding a single candle that somehow burned steadily despite the downpour. The rain sluiced around him, pattering against his coat and dripping from his hair. Yet the candlelight remained steady, warm and golden against the darkness. He didn't speak. He didn't move except for the subtle shift of his weight, just enough to suggest he was alive. But the thing that froze me where I sat was his eyes. Hollow, unblinking, and focused entirely on me. It wasn't anger or hunger. It was something deeper, something that felt like it was seeing straight through me, to every thought I had ever tried to hide, every secret I had tried to bury. I called out, my voice trembling, "Hello? Are you?" The words cut off as the storm swallowed them whole. The man didn't react. He didn't even blink. He simply stared, candlelight flickering across his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his cheekbones, the hollows beneath his eyes. I felt my chest tighten, my throat dry, as though the air in the cabin had become thicker, heavier, pressing down on me. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but I realized I had left it in my bag, and even if I hadn't, I couldn't imagine calling anyone to tell them this. No one would believe it. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking, and stepped toward the window. "Sir, do you need help?" I kept my voice steady, or at least I tried, but each word felt small and insignificant against the storm. The man didn't respond. He didn't flinch. And then, just as I drew close enough to see the candle clearly, he was gone. Nothing remained on the porch except the candle itself, still burning, the flame unbent by the rain, the wax dripping slowly over the sides. I blinked several times, certain my mind was playing tricks on me, but the candle didn't disappear. I opened the door cautiously, stepping onto the slick wood of the porch. Water sluiced around my boots, the storm roaring in my ears. The candle stood upright, perfectly balanced, and the flame danced softly, impossibly warm in the cold, wet night. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the candle, burning as though it had been placed by someone, or something that didn't belong in the world I knew. I brought the candle inside and set it on the table, hands trembling. The storm still raged outside, but the cabin felt emptier now, somehow quieter. I tried to convince myself it had been a neighbor, or a traveler seeking shelter, but the road to the cabin was treacherous and rarely used. No one comes up here in the middle of a storm. No one leaves a candle burning outside in a storm and disappears. And yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, clinging to me like wet clothing. Sleep came fitfully, each gust of wind or drop of water against the cabin sending me bolt upright, eyes darting toward the windows. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world drenched and glistening, but the memory of him, the hollow eyes, the candlelight, remained vivid. I checked the porch, expecting the candle to have burned down or melted away entirely, but it was gone, and yet the damp would still seem to carry the memory of his presence. The boards were slick, the rain pooled in small puddles, but nothing else suggested someone had stood there the night before. Over the following days, I tried to put it out of my mind, busying myself with chores and the company of my friend when he returned. But the feeling persisted, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Every time I walked past the window, I felt the weight of someone's gaze, fleeting but undeniable. At night, when the cabin was dark and the fire had died down, I could swear I saw shapes in the corners, shadows that weren't mine, shifting just beyond the candlelight. And sometimes, when the wind was right, I thought I could hear him, whispering something I couldn't quite make out, carried through the trees and the empty spaces of the cabin. Weeks later, long after I had left the cabin and returned to the relative safety of town, I found myself thinking about that night. I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the unearthly calm of the candle, the way he had looked at me as though he knew things no one else could. I told myself it was nothing. Exhaustion, imagination, the isolation of the mountains playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew it was more than that. Something about him had been deliberate, patient, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to understand. And sometimes, when the wind carries the faint smell of wet pine and rain, I swear I see him again, just for a moment, standing beyond the window, candle in hand, staring at me with those hollow eyes. He doesn't move, doesn't speak, but I feel every secret I've ever kept pressed against my skin, whispered in a voice I can't quite hear, lingering just beyond the edge of comprehension. I don't know who he is, or why he came, or why he left that candle burning, but I know this: the mountains are patient. They wait. And sometimes they choose someone to watch. Even now, when I close my eyes in the dark, I can see him. Candlelight reflecting in wet, hollow eyes, the storm pressing against the cabin walls, and that impossible stillness, waiting for me to look back. I can't explain it, and I know I never will. All I know is that night changed something inside me, and the memory of him will never fade. The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering the winding mountain road with a rhythm that made the world outside the windshield blur into a gray smear. The forest pressed close to either side, dark and dripping, branches sagging under the weight of the storm, and the low roar of water running down the hillsides filled my ears. I had been driving for hours trying to get ahead of the storm, but the sky seemed to be collapsing, and every mile felt like it took twice as long as it should. The headlights bounced off the wet asphalt, reflecting ghostly shapes of trees that leaned over the road like spectators watching me stumble through the night. I had no real plan, no clear destination, but then I remembered the cabin from childhood trips. Small, tucked away just past the ridge, a place my parents used to stop during hikes. It felt like a lifeline, a promise of shelter in the storm. When I finally spotted it through the sheets of rain, I almost didn't recognize it. The cabin had aged, the wood darkened and slick, the roof bowed under years of neglect, but the windows glowed with warmth, or at least I thought they did at first. My pulse quickened as I pulled into the small clearing and parked under the sheltering trees, the branches dripping onto the hood of my car. The wind whistled between the eaves, tugging at my coat as I stepped out, and the rain soaked me instantly despite my efforts to stay under the canopy. The smell of wet earth and moss was strong, familiar, almost comforting in a strange way. I pushed open the door, expecting it to creak emptily and to find dust and shadows inside. I was ready for the silence of abandonment. But the cabin was not empty. A fire burned in the stone hearth, flames dancing as though they had been tended just moments ago. The warmth hit me immediately, cutting through the cold rain clinging to my hair and clothes. My hands trembled as I stepped inside, glancing around the single room. Everything looked familiar: the worn wooden table, the chairs with peeling varnish, the small bookshelf in the corner. But there was a note on the table that made my stomach drop. It was written in my handwriting. I stared at it, mouth dry, fingers hovering over the paper. I had never touched a pen, never written anything like this. The words were simple, almost mundane, yet they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. My name was scrawled at the top, followed by a short message: "Welcome back." I dropped the paper, and it fluttered to the floor as if trying to escape my gaze. The firelight flickered across the walls, and I realized the cabin wasn't as empty as I thought. Above me, the floorboards creaked. I froze, heart hammering. The cabin had only one room. There was no upstairs, no hidden loft, nothing that could make the sound I just heard. My eyes darted to the ceiling, to the rafters, but saw only dark, empty wood. The creak came again, heavier this time, deliberate, echoing in the corners of the room. I swallowed hard and whispered my own name, half in disbelief, half in fear. "Ellie." The words felt absurdly small against the roar of the storm outside. No response. I moved toward the door to leave, but something made me pause. Shadows shifted in the corners of the room, long and fluid, stretching unnaturally. And I heard it. My name again, softer this time, like the murmur of the wind in the trees, carried through the creaking timbers. Ellie. My breath caught in my throat. I had never felt such a weight in a place, as though the walls themselves were aware of me, aware of my presence and waiting. I backed toward the hearth, my eyes scanning the room for any rational explanation, but there was none. The fire burned steadily, the shadows rippling across the walls, and somewhere deep in the cabin, I could feel the pulse of the storm echoing in perfect time with the echo in my chest. Then the footsteps came again, slow, deliberate, circling overhead, or somewhere above me. Each step felt impossibly precise, deliberate, like someone pacing just out of sight. I spun toward the door, fumbling with the handle, but the cold metal felt heavier than it should, as if the cabin itself were resisting my departure. Another step, louder this time, and I swore I could hear a whisper threading through the sound. My name again, insistent, intimate. Ellie. Come back. Panic clawed at my chest. I bolted, leaving the note and the firelight behind, and stumbled into the rain. The cabin's walls seemed to pulse behind me, dark and wet, breathing with a life I could not comprehend. I didn't look back until I reached the edge of the clearing, panting, soaked, and shivering from both cold and fear. The cabin stood as it had when I arrived, dark, silent now, though I could swear the windows glimmered as though they had seen me running. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of that place. I see the way the fire flickered, the note on the table, the shadows that moved when no one else was there. I hear the footsteps sometimes, in the quiet of my apartment, or in the still moments before sleep. A soft creak above me, a whisper of my name, and the memory of the cabin rises like the scent of wet pine after a storm. It wasn't just that the cabin knew my name. It knew me. Every thought I tried to hide, every fear I carried, every corner of my memory. I feel as though the walls remembered. The way it waited, patient and unyielding, for me to return, is something I can't explain and perhaps never will. And part of me knows, with a certainty that chills my blood, that if I ever go back, the cabin will recognize me again. The fire will be burning, the shadows will stretch, and my name will be whispered, soft and intimate, through the empty room. I try to tell myself it was a trick of memory, imagination, or the storm, but no rational explanation can ease the knot in my chest. The cabin is out there in the mountains, waiting, watching, holding the memory of me as I once held the memory of it, and I can't help but wonder if it will ever let me leave again. The storm hit the mountains with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated, turning the slick highway into a ribbon of black water. Rain pounded the hood of my car, rattled the windshield, and filled the air with that heavy metallic scent that always comes before lightning strikes. I had been driving for hours trying to outrun the storm, but the further I went, the more isolated the road became. The forest leaned close on either side, dark pines dripping with rain, and every curve in the highway seemed to loop back on itself, as though the mountains were folding in around me. I couldn't see more than a few yards ahead, and my tires slid occasionally on patches of slick leaves and mud. Then, through the sheets of rain, I saw it, a gas station. Small, battered, and sitting alone in a clearing that seemed impossibly remote. Its lights flickered weakly, casting pale, trembling pools of light onto the asphalt. The sign creaked in the wind, swinging back and forth on rusted chains. I slowed immediately, relief and exhaustion washing over me. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the thought of stopping for fuel, or even just a moment away from the storm, was irresistible. The station smelled of wet asphalt and decay, a faint metallic tang that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I pulled up to the pump, the tires hissing on the water-slick pavement, and cut the engine. The air was thick with the smell of ozone from the storm, mixed with the sharp stench of gasoline and something older, more organic, like damp wood and rot. The station itself looked abandoned in every sense, except that the lights were on and the register inside chimed faintly as I pushed the door open. I stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing thinly, and was met with the musty smell of the interior. Paper, stale coffee, mildew. The shelves were mostly bare, dusty cans and jars staring at me blankly. A man behind the counter looked up, nodding faintly, though his features were hard to read in the dim light. He didn't speak. I fumbled with my wallet, paid for some coffee and snacks, and felt his eyes on me the entire time, though I wasn't sure he was even human, or if I had simply imagined the shape of a face in the shadows. The transaction was silent, mechanical. I grabbed my items and left as quickly as I could, the storm pressing against me from all sides, rain soaking through my coat before I even reached the car. And then I realized something was wrong. The station was gone. I slammed the door shut behind me, heart pounding, and blinked. The clearing had vanished. The asphalt under my tires gave way to wet earth, roots, and shadows stretching from the forest. The trees leaned close, dense and black, and there was no gas station, no lights, no clearing. Just rain, forest, and darkness that pressed in like it had been waiting for me to notice. My mirrors reflected nothing but more trees, endless rain, and the slick highway curving impossibly into the distance. The road I had just driven seemed to have been swallowed, leaving no trace. I fumbled with the ignition, but the engine felt sluggish, almost hesitant, as if the car itself knew it was out of place. I tried to back up to retrace my path, but the highway was gone, replaced entirely by a slope that led into dense forest. Panic surged. I pounded the wheel, shouted into the storm, but the wind swallowed every sound. The rain fell harder, as though mocking my confusion, and the shadows between the trees deepened, shifting with some subtle, impossible intelligence. I pressed forward cautiously, trying to find any trace of the station or the road. Each step felt like pushing through molasses. The wet earth clung to my tires, slowing me, resisting me. Occasionally, I thought I saw shapes, glimpses of figures standing in the shadows, watching me, dissolving when I looked directly. Nothing moved with life, yet there was a weight in the air, an intent, as if I was being measured, catalogued, assessed for reasons I couldn't understand. The air smelled of decay and ozone, and somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard a bell ringing faintly, like the door of a store long gone. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time no longer made sense. I drove, slid, and skidded through the endless storm, clinging to the thin ribbon of road that occasionally appeared under my tires. And then, impossibly, the familiar shapes of town appeared. Streetlights, buildings, the muted hum of civilization. My pulse slowed only slightly. I glanced at my GPS, half expecting it to confirm the station, or at least the road I had traveled. But it did show the station, bright and clear, sitting exactly where I had seen it. Even stranger, there was no record of the clearing on any map I had ever checked. No addresses, no roads leading there. Just the station, waiting, untouched by reality. I couldn't explain it. The storm had cleared, the night had ended, and yet the memory of that station, the smell, the flickering lights, the man behind the counter, silent and watching, haunted me. It wasn't just the disappearance. It was the sense that it had been there, waiting, patient and deliberate, for someone to see it. That awareness lingered, like the forest itself had leaned closer, and some part of the mountains had taken note of me. Even now, when I drive those roads in fair weather, I glance into the trees at night, half expecting to see the flicker of lights, the outline of a lone building, the silhouette of that man behind a counter that shouldn't exist. I can still feel it, the weight of observation, the silence behind his gaze, and the subtle insistence that I had been expected. Something about the station, the way it appeared and vanished, left me with a chill I can't shake. It knew I would come. And in some way, I understand now that it's still out there, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough or desperate enough to notice it.